Hey everyone, I'm Jason Roberts, and in this video I'm going to show you how to edit an astrophotography photo from this to this. This is a photo I took in my previous video, like a beginner's guide to astrophotography. I'll put a link in the description to that video, and in this video we're going to use Lightroom to go and edit one of the photos that I took when I was out shooting that video. Let's go. Here we are in Lightroom with the raw image open, and if you want to, you can go and do some cropping first. I'm not going to do that in this image. And the first thing we're going to do is come down to the lens correction section here. We're going to turn on chromatic aberrations and also enable profile corrections. This is going to use a lens profile to help fix any distortion in the image. Sometimes this can be a bit aggressive, especially with the vignetting, so I'm going to just reduce the vignetting here until I get a roughly even edge to the frame. Another little tip is if you right click on the background here and set this to black. When you're editing astro images, it can be helpful because you can see the edges of the frame and if they're too light or not. So that doesn't look too bad. There is a bit of a lightness at this top right hand part of the image here, but that's because the moon was out as a half moon. So we've got a little bit of light interference from the moon there. We'll deal with that in a little bit. Another tip is to use this navigator here to get a smaller view of the image you're editing. So for example, if you're changing the vignette here, sometimes it can be easier to see the effect in this zoomed out navigator rather than in the main image, especially if you're using a high resolution screen. Alright, so we'll leave the vignette correction about there for now, and we'll just go and close the lens correction section. So the next thing you can do is zoom in and go and perform any cleanup on the image. So for example, you might have some dust specks from your camera. There is this interesting thing here, and I'm not sure if this is a piece of dust or something on the lens, or whether this is actually a small comet or something. You can kind of see a little bit of the tail coming off here. Well, if it was a comet, that would be the tail. If you know what this is, let me know in the comments below. You can see it up here. So I'm not going to bother with any cleanup in this image. The next thing you want to do is come over to the basic tab and set your white balance. You can try starting off from anywhere between 3500 to 5500, and you want to get a fairly neutral looking image, not too blue and not too yellow. Of course, there's a little bit of taste involved in this, so if you like the look of the image, just go with that. Another thing you could try is to zoom in on a bright star and then use the eyedropper here and just select the white of a star and see how you like the look of that. I don't particularly like the magenta cast that's created, so I'm just going to reset that and just find a white balance that I think looks acceptable as a starting point. So that's looking okay. I like the fact that we've got a little bit of magenta or red coming through there, but I could try and correct that a little bit, but I think we'll stick with 5333 for the color temperature. You can always tweak this later if you want to. So now we've set the white balance, we can start to think about the overall exposure of the image. So we're going to start off by adding a little bit of contrast here, and that's just going to help the stars start to pop out a little bit from the darker sky. The next thing you can try and do is add a bit of dehaze to the image. So watch what happens when I increase this dehaze amount. Notice that the stars appear to kind of come through a bit more. If you go too far, it's just going to break up, so you don't want to go too far with this. So let's try something about there, 23 dehaze. If you want a softer, more dreamy feeling image, you can try lowering the texture and the clarity down here a bit. Notice it kind of goes soft and dreamy, but that's probably not what you're going to want. You can, however, do this for stylistic reasons. So let's just reset those to 0. The next thing we're going to do is close this basic panel and come to the Tone Curve panel. I'm going to click on this icon here, and this is going to give us these regions. If you've got a little bit of overexposure in the stars, you can try dropping this highlights down a little bit. This image isn't too bad, so I'm just going to leave that at 0. But this lights region here really can help to bring out the stars. Obviously, if you push it too much, it's going to look a little bit overblown, but you can see, if I just drop that back down and increase it again, you can see all the stars, and especially the Milky Way there, really starting to pop out. You can, of course, overdo this. Once again, this is to taste, so I'm going to go about the plus 80 mark there. This is starting to look a tiny bit too bright, so what I'm going to do is come back to the basic tab, and I'm just going to drop the exposure just a tiny amount. Doesn't need a lot there, so I've dropped that to minus 0.18. You can come back to the tone curve and then continue to adjust the lights and the overall exposure just to get it looking how you want. What I'm going to do is also come into this section here, and I'm going to create a very shallow S-shaped curve. What this is going to do is add a tiny bit more contrast to the image. So once again, you don't want to overdo that too much. So something around there. And if you want to, you can toggle on and off this tone curve by pressing this button here, and you can see a before and an after. Essentially what this curve is doing is this point is lowering the darks and this point is increasing the lights. And that's what creates a bit of extra contrast. If we want to, we can now come back and tweak the dehaze amount. So I'm going to just play with this a little bit till I get things looking how I want. So that's quite an aggressive amount of dehaze there at +40. You can see the sky starting to look a little bit too blue now and a little bit oversaturated. That's partly because of the contrast we've added. So what we can do now is we can actually kind of combat this a little bit by dropping the saturation at a global level. So I'm just going to pull that down a little bit, maybe about the -25 mark. So if you're happy with that, the next thing you can do is we'll just close this basic panel and we'll come down to this color grading panel. You can use this panel to kind of add a bit of stylistic color to the image. You probably don't want to go too overboard here though. Basically what you can do is for the highlights, the shadows and the midtones here, is you can introduce some color into those specific areas of the image. Let's start off with the highlights here. And what we're going to do is we'll drag it all the way out. So we've just reset that for you. All I did there was drag this circle all the way out to the red. And then if you click this outer bit here, you can rotate around and rotate through the colors. What I'm going to do here is probably go for a little bit of a red color. And once you've chosen your color, if you click and hold on this circle, you can kind of bring down the effect and make it a bit more subtle. The closer you go to the middle, the less of that color you're going to add. If I move it right out to the edge, you can see it's really kind of red. And if I move it into the middle, it starts to get a little bit more subtle. So I think I'm going to bring that in just a little bit more. Like I say, you don't want to go too overboard with this. And once you're happy with that, you can go and have a play with the midtones. Once again, start off by dragging this to the outside and then choosing a color. Once again, I'm going to stick with the kind of reds and oranges here, maybe a bit more towards the orange, and then click and then drag this back towards the center just to make it more subtle. I'm just going to tweak the color a little bit more towards the oranges. If you want to see the before and after for color grading, just click this toggle button here. So that's before and that's after. I think there might still be a little bit too much magenta in the image, but we can fix that later if we want to. The next thing we're going to do is look at sharpening and noise reduction. So come into the detail tab here. We currently don't have any sharpening or noise reduction applied, but we do have some of this color noise reduction applied. I'm just going to drop that back down to 0 for a minute. And what I'm going to do is just zoom in down here. You can see this kind of speckled color noise. Hopefully with the YouTube video compression you can see this. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to slowly increase this and watch what happens to this color noise. You should at some point see it mostly go away. And if I keep increasing this slider, it doesn't really get too much better, but if I drop it back down to 0, it comes back. So what you want to do here is just gradually increase that until you see the noise go away. And when it starts to basically not get any better, you can leave that setting there. So it's about 23 at the minute. If you want to, you can have a play with the detail and smoothness sliders here and see if you can fine tune this color noise, but it's okay to leave it as the defaults. Let's take a look next at sharpening. What I suggest you do is start with a value of about 30, and then you can adjust upwards and downwards from about 30 just to get the look that you want. Another tip, if I just zoom out, if you do happen to have meteor trails like this one here, these can be helpful when you're playing with sharpening. This is with no sharpening, and as I increase this, you can see that meteor trail gets a little bit sharper, and if you go too far, it just looks horrible. So just gradually increase that until you see that line look nice and sharp, but not too sharp. Probably about there, 21. If you want to, you can have a play with the radius and detail sliders here, but it's okay to leave those at their default values for the moment. You can now make use of this masking slider to apply the sharpening effect only on certain parts of the image. The best way to do this is to hold down the Alt key on your keyboard and then start dragging this. If I drag it all the way over here, the white spots are where the sharpening is going to be applied. And if I drag it all the way over here, because everything's white, sharpening will be applied to the whole image. What I'm going to do is zoom out and do this again. Once again, hold down Alt, and then just start to increase that slider. Let go of Alt and have a look how things look. So that's a value of 77. and that's a value of 0. Once again, we'll fine tune that, and once again zoom in just to double check things, and if you're happy with that you can zoom back out. The next thing we're going to adjust is this noise reduction here. The more you increase this slider, the less noise you're going to get in the image, but the more you increase it, the more cartoony and kind of plastic looking the image becomes. If I just whack this up all the way to 100, you can see we've lost a lot of detail here and things just look kind of plasticky and cartoony and really soft and glowing, but we've lost a lot of detail. So let's just drop this back down to 0 and you can see all the noise come back. One way to set this noise reduction level is to zoom into the image again and then start increasing it. At some point you're going to see the fainter stars start to disappear. If I keep going, you can see some of those faint stars are kind of so blurred out that when you zoom out they've basically almost disappeared from view. So you can play with this and find a balance between the noise and the detail in the image. So I'm going to go with about 18 there. Just going to hit Y on the keyboard now to see a before and after, and you can see in the after version on the right hand side here that we've really started to bring out some of those details in the stars. So that's the global edit complete. We can now start to look at some local adjustments. The first local adjustment I want to make is to darken that sand at the bottom of the image. So I'm going to use a graduated filter here and then just draw up from the bottom until the middle line just crosses where the sand and the ocean start. I'm going to double click here to reset that effect, and then I'm going to drop the exposure. If you hit O on your keyboard, you can see this red mask open and closing showing you what you're affecting. So I think that's a little bit too dark. We'll try about the 44 mark. Looking at the image now, I don't really like this light band of sky here. So I'm going to click on the graduated filter again, come down here and click on the one we just created, and I'm going to drag it up quite far here. And I'm also going to reduce the highlights just a little bit, and then maybe just tweak this, just to try and keep the focus on the stars a bit more. Remember earlier I said that we had that bit of moonlight. I'm going to use another graduated filter, just drag it down here, double click to reset. I'm just going to very slightly drop the exposure here just to try and even that out a little bit. I also want to just brighten the water a little bit, so I'm going to come up here to this radial filter, click on that, and I'm going to draw an oval kind of over this water area here. Just reduce the width of that, something like that. And I'm going to click invert so it only applies the effect to what's inside that circle. Just reset that. I'm going to add a little bit of exposure just to brighten up that water, and maybe just increase the highlights on that water just a touch. We don't want to detract from the Milky Way and the stars too much. Just a couple of bonus tips if you do have the Milky Way in your photo. To really make the Milky Way pop out, what you can do is come up to this local adjustment brush here, and you want to make sure down here that the flow is not really high. Reduce it to somewhere about the 20 mark, and then we'll just zoom into the image here. And what we're going to do is we're going to paint over some of the darker areas. You can use the square brackets to increase and decrease the size of the brush here. And what we're going to do is we're going to reduce the exposure of those darker areas. I'll set this to a quite dark exposure just so you can see what happens when we start painting in here. I'm going to do this super quickly, but obviously you can spend more time on it. Just painting in some of those darker areas in the Milky Way. And what this is going to do is it's going to give us a little bit of extra contrast in that Milky Way. If I just reset this and then slowly drop. Obviously if you go too far it's going to look horrendous, so just be very, very subtle with this. Even that's probably a bit too dark. So we'll go about the -1.0. Also, if we really want to bring out that Milky Way, we can create another radial filter. And what we're going to do is just drag that out, angle it a little bit. Notice the red area is outside. We want to click invert so we can modify what's the inside. Double click on this effect text here to reset it. What we're going to do is gradually, gently brighten what's inside here. Obviously don't go too far, otherwise it'll look horrible. So we'll go about maybe plus 0.37. And you can also experiment with adding a touch of clarity. So we'll just add a tiny amount of clarity there. Probably don't want to go more than 10, so we'll leave it about 9. What we can now go and do is duplicate this radial mask. So right click on the point in the middle and click duplicate. And then uncheck invert and reset the effect. What we're going to do now is darken everything outside of this. So if I drop the slider, notice how everything outside it gets darker. So this is kind of to taste how you want this effect to look. I'm going to go with about -17 for the exposure. But if you want a really highly stylized image, you can even drop this down even to like -1. For this one though, I'm not going to go quite as stylized. We'll stick at about -0.17. You can also try dropping the highlights here if you want to. And once again, keep an eye on the navigator at the top left here. What you want to make sure you do is for both of these radial masks, make sure you've got a decent amount of feathering. If you have too little feathering, makes it really obvious. So just increase the feather here. So let's try about 70. Once again, if you hit O on your keyboard, you can kind of visualize that feather as well. And if you need to, just expand that a little bit. As a finishing touch, we can go and add a post-crop vignette. So come down to the effects tab here. And then you can play with the vignette amount. What I like to do is actually go the other way so you can see the white of it. And then you can play with these other sliders such as the midpoint just to get the effect that you're looking for. So I'm going to drop this down quite a lot and then drag the amount back the other way to create a dark vignette. Again, you can do this to taste. I'm going to go about, I don't know, about the -20, -21 mark. If I go and hit the / key on the keyboard, you can see the before, and if I hit / again, you can see the after. I'll put the final high-res version of this photo on screen in just a moment. Let me know in the comments if you found this video helpful. Also make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, and I'll see you in the next one.